Our next presenter this evening is Tod Augusta-Scott. Tod is a clinical social worker and is internationally known for his work with gender-based violence, restorative approaches, trauma, and narrative therapy. He has worked in community-based organizations for over 25 years and worked to support families in the Canadian Armed Forces for over 15 years. He is the co-founder of the Canadian Domestic Violence Conference and has taught in the Department of Social Work at Dalhousie University. He serves on the Advisory Council for the Status of Women in Canada. It is my pleasure to introduce Tod. Please go ahead, Tod.
There we go. Thank you so much, Catherine. Glad to be here. So I'm Tod from the East Coast here, Nova Scotia. And in my 15 minutes, I'm going to be really focusing on clinical practice, and it's going to be focused specifically around gender-based violence in terms of intimate partner violence. There's going to be overlap in terms of how we would work with sexual violence as well. But specifically, my examples will focus around intimate partner violence. Again, as Catherine mentioned, I've worked really in two locations throughout my career, one within the CF, working on the issues of intimate partner violence within families, and also in the community in a nonprofit group in rural Nova Scotia called Bridges. And over the last 20 25 years, the work has changed quite a bit. We really just had kind of polarized conversations in the beginning stages where it was just one person did all the harm and one person was completely harmed, and that's sometimes the configuration. Often what we find is there's that's one configuration, that there's just lots of different complications that are going on in these relationships. So now I'm really thinking about, and we're really thinking about, the work in terms of repairing harm. So after harm's been done, and supporting people to learn how to repair harm when they've been harmed and when they've harmed other people. With that in mind, what we're trying to do is create processes where we can repair harm, help people repair harm in ways that don't create more harm. So that's kind of one of the mantras that we have in the work, is that how do we engage people when they've been harmed and when they've harmed other people in ways that don't create more harm through that process. I'm going to be outlining really a process that comes under the umbrella of restorative justice. I want to be clear when I'm talking about restorative justice in the context of intimate partner violence that I'm not talking about necessarily restoring intimate relationships. So it's really about finding processes for repairing harm. So a relationship may get restored or may not, but the reality is for most of these couples that we deal with is that they're not going to be separated. They're connected through having children, or they're connected through living in the same small community. And so part of the focus of our work is about looking at repairing harm. And often those people who've been harmed in these relationships, not only want the harm to stop, towards themselves, but any future partners, they would want to stop the harm and hear about that from the person who had done the harm in the first place. And I want to be clear, when we're talking about, there's of course different types of abuse, but there's also different severity of abuse that we work with. In the early days, we thought that it was all, habitual and severe violence. And of course, sometimes it is. We're dealing with that on a regular basis. Much of the content of the conversations around emotional, psychological abuse, that's the majority of the work. The chronic physical violence doesn't characterize and the high risk stuff doesn't characterize most of the work. So there's also kind of moderate and low levels of harm too. So when I'm using that, I'm not only talking about the kind of severe habitual abuse that happens in relationships. I'm also, when I'm talking about restorative in the context of intimate partner violence, I'm also not necessarily talking about face-to-face contact. Often restorative justice is associated with getting people together in circles. That's not what I mean. It's really, this approach is about how to be responsive to individuals and individual families. Sometimes it's going to be helpful to have face-to-face conversations, and sometimes it's not. But you can still, even if you don't have face-to-face contact, harm can still be repaired through either through letters or through emails or through counselors talking with each other. It doesn't necessarily mean that the two parties, because of course sometimes the two parties being seen face to face is going to create more harm, so we wouldn't be setting up those kind of conversations. So again, restorative practice in this context is really about repairing harm and finding out ways of repairing harm in ways that don't create more harm. So just looking at this process that you can see on the board right here, there's 3 phases is how we're thinking of the work at this point. The first phase is, you can see there's 2 people entering from the bottom, actually, in phase 1, going up through phase 2 and phase 3. And you can see there's the two parties would be entering into phase 1. Part of what that's representing, phase 1 and phase 2, the parties are seen separately. The parties we'd only open up communication between the two parties in phase 3. And each party has their own counselor, their own completely separate counselor. So they're on their own journey through phase 1 and phase 2, and they may connect at phase 3. So I just want to slow that down a little bit more. So phase 1 is really about looking at issues of safety. So when intimate partner violence, these cases are referred in, first what we're, there's of course the community is attending to safety, like police separating the two parties, or shelters setting up physical safety. And in terms of counseling, part of what we're doing to set up safety would be often dealing with issues of trauma. So if people are kind of disassociating in the room because they're scared of the whole process, part of it is about finding ways of grounding people so they can actually think clearly and think through in terms of what their values are, what's important to them, and for those who've done severe harm, to be able to slow that down. And then, if they've been harmed, to be able to look at that. So then as safety is established in phase 1, then a person would move into phase 2, which is really looking at preparing people and supporting people to be able to repair harm in relationships, both when they've been harmed and when they've harmed others. And those would be the kind of conversations that they would engage in phase 3. Often that process of preparing people to repair harm, when they're in either those positions of being harmed and harming others, often that involves addressing issues of trauma that people have experienced, because often, for example, when people come from traumatic childhoods, often being angry in a relationship is coded as yelling and screaming. So when I'm often asking, so if I'm working with a guy, for example, and I'm asking him, how would he prefer to express anger in his relationship? Often for a lot of guys who have experienced trauma and childhoods characterized by violence, often they don't know what I mean. How would you choose to express your anger? That what they're thinking is that anger and abuse and yelling and screaming are synonymous, that those are the same things, that there is no choice that actually is happening there. And part of that is the effects of trauma. And so part of the asking them the questions, how would they prefer to actually express anger, does 2 things. One, it addresses their agency, which is often undermined by childhood trauma, where they don't feel like and notice how they're making choices. And it also gives them an opportunity to separate out and think, oh yeah, that expressing anger doesn't have to be done through yelling and screaming and throwing things and so forth, that there's anger is just an emotion that we all have, and that we can choose to how we're going to express it. And in fact, there's lots of important things to be angry about that need to be addressed, unfairness and so forth. And how do we do that? So part of that is about, often both the women and the men come in with experiences of trauma, and they're often trying to express what they want in a relationship through anger, but they're conflating, of course, yelling and screaming with anger. And so part of that's just one example of how some of the negative effects of trauma need to be addressed in this preparing somebody to be able to talk about how they've been harmed, either in this relationship or in past relationships, and what they want as a result of that. So we'd also at this point look at issues of gender too, the messages that come from experiences of trauma often get supported by messages around gender. So just for example, it's not uncommon for the guys who've experienced trauma that we work with to to be drinking, to be silent, to be, violent, and so forth. And then if we look at how what are some of the ideas, messages they get around masculinity? Often masculinity is encouraging the more you drink, the more you man you are. That men are only allowed to get angry, and that part of being violent and competitive and being right all the time. And so we can actually see that there's an interface, a support of symptoms of trauma, and also these notions of unhelpful masculinity that often are influencing the guy's choices to use abuse in relationships. So those would be part of the conversations in phase 2, preparing people how to respond when they've been harmed, and also how to respond when they've harmed others. And so it's also moving them out of ideas of like revenge. You hurt me, so I hurt you. That you disrespect me, so I disrespect you. So moving away from ideas of kind of an eye for an eye, kind of the revenge stuff, to thinking about repair and what does that actually mean in relationships. Because often a lot of the people we work with, they don't have a template for repair in relationship. Often, when mistakes happen or bad choices were made, that resulted in punishment and violence. That's often the template they have for how to respond when people have been hurt, or when they've been hurt, or somebody's or if they make mistakes or hurt other people. And so part of this is giving them a process of actually repairing harm. So rather than thinking that mistakes or whatever require punishment, that we can actually think about processes that actually just might focus on repairing harm in relationships. So that's part of the preparation of phase 2, which would then lead to phase 3, where counselors, so that both counselors, so just before we get to the next slide, both counselors are would be, so if we ever were in the room together, both counselors would be in the room together. We would still have individual conversations and conversations together. Both parties would have to be prepared. We'd only invite somebody into a phase 3 conversation if they were in phase 3. So we're not going to have a setup where, if it's a woman and a man, we're not going to have a setup where, he's in phase 1 and she's in phase 3, and she wants to talk and he wants to talk. That's still not going to happen, because it's going to be harmful for her if he's not also in phase 3. At the same time, even though the person who you initiated this process with, there's a possibility that you may not have an opportunity to actually repair harm with them. The person still learns how to repair harm in a relationship. So whether it's with that person who brought them into the system, which is kind of like the golden triangle piece, even if that communication doesn't get opened up, it could be in person or through video or through letters or just through the counselors talking back and forth, that they're still empowered to be able to repair harm in relationships, both when they've done harm and when they've been harmed. The next slide. I just want to spend a little bit of time on phase 3, because most of the field is often focused around the phase 1, I find, and some of the phase 2. I find this idea of phase 3 doesn't have as much currency in the field, and there's different reasons for that, which we can talk about. But I want to spend some more time just with the phase 3. So phase 3, there's really looking at 4 parts of kind of a repair process, and this is really thinking about the 4 components of the repair. I'm really drawing on Judith Herman's work in terms of what people, when they've been harmed, what do they actually want from the person who did the harm that would actually help repair what happened. And so these are, and it's not to limit what people want, but it includes often these 4 things, and part of it is acknowledging the harm, and the person to take responsibility for the harm that they've done is often a healing part of the process of repairing harm. It's all, it's powerful for in the configuration where the guy's used abuse against his female partner or any others. But in a situation where if we're having for for partners who have access to conversations where the guy is actually saying, that I'm 100% responsible for the abuse that I did to you, that those are my choices, and that I know that I blamed you and that was wrong for me to blame you. Those are often very powerful conversations for those women to actually have. And part of the conversation again is the phase 3 is about setting up conversations where the guys, or if they're the ones using abuse, the guy can actually repair the harm that he's done, and in this case through blaming her for his abuse and his violence. I mean, we've been really trying to convince women for years that they weren't to blame for the abuse, but then when we actually started setting up these kind of conversations and actually we're having the person who actually did the harm actually take responsibility and actually tell her that she wasn't to blame, the process became much more powerful for those women who had access to those conversations. So that's acknowledging the harm, agreeing to a plan to stop the harm. So it's often, for the person who's been harmed, it is important for them to know what the plan is. How do they know that this harm's not going to happen again to them or to anybody else, and to have some kind of detailed understanding of what the plan is that's been worked out to make sure that they won't be harmed again. And so that whole feeling safe again, restoring that, looking at acknowledging the effects. So it's about moving past the minimizing the seriousness of the abuse or denying the abuse, and actually acknowledging what the harm has been. And that really sets the groundwork for then being able to once people are thinking about the effects, and there's lots of preparation in phase 2 that would go into this. And then we would look at moving into repairing the harm, and the effects of the abuse. So then it moves into agreeing to a follow-up plan to repair the effects. So just this acknowledgement is very important often. Hearing about the plan to stop the harm and having the effects acknowledged, that is all part of repairing the harm. Then there could be other things that can be done outside these conversations, like actually actually looking at repairing holes in walls or money or whatever the case. So there's just different examples of repair that can look like. So I just to move to the next slide, just my last slide here, about looking at a phase 3. So if people wanted to know more about this work and what it can look like, there's actually a documentary that was made on the work. Sarah Polley, for those of you who know, Canadian director, was the executive producer on it. And it illustrates really phase 3 conversations that can happen. And they happen between Atia, who's here on the right, and Steve, who's on the left. And part of what happened was wasn't about restoring an intimate relationship. They had been in a relationship in their late teens, and where Steve beat up Tia severely on a regular basis over a 2-year period. And she left that relationship and joined the shelter movement and was in the shelter movement for 20 years. And she met Steve on the street in Toronto. And it occurred to her, that if I ever see Steve again, I'm going to ask him if he'll allow me to videotape me interviewing him about our relationship to find out, what was happening. And so, lo and behold, they do accidentally meet up again, and she asks him, and he agrees to the interview. And so she does the interview with him. It's like 2.5 hours. They're in a coffee shop. This is a image from that footage that they did themselves. Atia's friend was behind the camera, and what she did, it was a powerful 2.5 hours. It's the first time she'd ever talked to any guy who had used abuse in his relationship, and it was the guy who had abused her. She didn't really know what to make of it after the 2.5 hours. She thought it was powerful and probably important, but again, this was the first time she didn't really know the context or how to understand it. And so then she reached out to me. She found me through some of the publications that I've done. and asked me if I'd be willing to look at the the raw footage to see if I thought it was for real, or if it was seemed important or not. And so she sent it to me here in Nova Scotia. And what I saw was just that they were trying to have the same restorative conversations that we have in our office on a pretty regular basis. And part of what was going on was Steve was trying to do right by her and trying to acknowledge what he did, and what he had done had haunted him for 20 years as well. So he was getting swamped in his shame too, as in the conversation. So part of what happened was that was part of the feedback I gave them. And then they flew me up to Toronto numerous times to actually work with them individually. And then I worked with them together in the similar process we just talked about. And so part of what happens is during that 20 years, Atia suffers from terrible post-traumatic stress disorder. She always has to have a safety plan when she leaves the house, always have to have a back to the wall, can't wear scarves, has terrible insomnia. And part of what happens through this process of Steve actually acknowledging the harm, hearing that how it stopped, hearing what him acknowledge the effects of the abuse, and part of his repair is actually creating this film and knowing that people are watching it. And so part of what happens through that process is that Atia's post-traumatic stress symptoms significantly diminish. She starts to sleep. She starts not having to have a safety plan every time she leaves the house. She starts to not be able to wear scarves again. And so part of the film is really about what would happen if in this case, a guy actually took responsibility for the harm that he had done. What difference would it actually make to the person who was harmed? And so that's really the thrust of the film. And you see mostly the phase 3 parts of the conversations. You don't really see too much of the phase 1 and phase 2 that I did with them. But you can see that if people want to look that up, you can just Google that online. It's available. So that's an example of kind of phase 3. So the 3 phases of the work to work with gender-based violence in the context of intimate partner violence. And, of course, not everybody makes it again to phase 3. So, and there's certainly personality disorders that aren't amenable to moving outside of phase 1, so it's not like this happens with every, person that they move from phase 1 to phase 3. And it happens with a lot of them. So thank you.
Thank you, Tod, for your insights on restorative approaches, repairing